Hey, Guns and Games here. Hope you all are doing well. Today in this video, I'm going to be covering the Chinese M21 SKS, and for reference, that's the one on the bottom. And I'm going to be kind of going over it and giving the some background history of the Chinese SKS in general and whatnot, and what kind of sets this specific one apart from other SKSs and all of the other Chinese SKSs, which there are quite a few different variants as well. So let's kind of get into it with the Chinese SKS specifically, sort of the background on that. China adopted the SKS in 1956. They called it the Type 56. And basically the original Chinese ones were essentially just copies of the Soviet ones, more or less. They built them on Soviet equipment and with Soviet help for a while to get them started. And like I said, they were basically identical. And in fact, they were identical. Initially, the initial ones were called Sino-Soviet SKSs and had both Chinese and Soviet markings on them. And they look literally just like Chinese SKSs. Those are extremely rare. Not very many of them were made. And then that was just in 1956. And then from that point onward, they were just Chinese markings. And from that point onward, they look a little bit different. Basically, the only difference really is the wood. They're using Chinese wood instead of Russian wood. So the wood quality is different. And that would actually continue on for quite a while. China would produce effectively a copy until about 1964-ish, roughly, when then they started, from that point onwards, switching it up a little bit and ultimately changing some things, kind of in vein of more like this aesthetically, again, starting in 1964. The big main difference that kind of sets the Chinese SKS apart is the spike bayonet versus the blade of the Soviet design. That's the big difference that was incorporated. The Chinese also kind of messed around with the sling placements. They would kind of deviate back and forth between being on the bottom and on the side. It's really about it. They did a couple other small things here and there, like incorporating this plastic handguard covering the gas tube called the Tickler, the French Tickler is what it was nicknamed. None of the original blade bayonet ones had this. This is specifically just for the spiker and onward. And even then, those were not put on initially either. It's about it. I mean, really, wood change, different wood, different stocks, obviously. That's really, for the most part, obviously different markings. That's really about it for the most part. Now, that switch over again happened in 64 with the spiker change. And that would continue on basically through 1970. Essentially. At the same time, they actually also started making a version called the M21 in the early 60s as well. Those are not any different than a standard Sino-Soviet style, except they were shipped for export and it basically supplied exclusively to Vietnam, northern Vietnam, basically. They'll have like M21 on the side of the receiver, but they're basically no different than the Russian copy. Then there's a second variation of M21 that came later, basically, and that's what this one is. This is one of the later M21s. The M21, or the late version of the M21, is basically China's best effort when it came to making the SKS. These are the finest, best made, best machining quality, best stocks, really everything across the board. This was their best effort when it came to making the SKS, was the late. These are referred to as late M21s. The other export Vietnamese ones are early M21s. This really is their best effort. So these were produced exclusively in 1970. That was it. They were made in 1970, just 1 year. And that was basically it. They might have been produced maybe into 71. There's not a lot of information out here. You know, China has not given us a lot of information about anything firearm related. We kind of just had to piece it together for the most part. But these started being produced. The standard, sort of regular spike bayonet guns continued on through 71, basically. This was just 1 year in 70. And then production of the SKS actually stopped after 1971 for a while. Well, from 1972 to 1977, they produced no SKSs. So production actually stopped. We don't really know why. As far as from what I was able to read, no one really knows why. They've not told us. Again, like I said, they don't tell us anything. Don't really know why. Production would start back up again in 1978 and would go on through 1981. This is the other half of the M21 and the regular Spiker. So both production of the regular Spiker and the M21 here would continue again for basically another 3 years. And then that was it as far as military SKSs go. Well, that was basically it. After that, from basically 1981 all the way through 1994, a large number of civilian and export, civilian market models were made for the next 13 years. And like I said, just a slew of different variants were made, like dozens and dozens were made and were exported into United States and Canada. And that went on again until 94, basically when the Chinese weapons were banned from import in 1994. Clinton banned them from import because China was kind of not being ethical in how they imported them, from what I've read as well. It was also part of the assault weapons ban as well. The assault weapons ban also played a part in it too. Basically, we just stopped allowing Chinese guns because China didn't really care who was getting them, and there were rumors abound that potentially gangs and unsavory people were getting their hands on them as well. So that stopped in 94, and China basically just stopped producing the SKS when that happened. They're like, all right, well, there's no market for them anymore. Canada still, Canada didn't ban them. Chinese weaponry is still legal in Canada to this day. They still get Chinese weaponry all the time. But China just didn't deem the SKS, Canada a big enough of a market to consider continuing the SKS. So they just stopped production of the SKS entirely. And China, by 1994, was the last country in the world still making the gun. The Soviet Union and some of the other Eastern Bloc countries stopped in the mid to late 50s, basically. There were only 3 countries, really, that continued on through the 60s. You had Yugoslavia here, China and Albania. North Korea did into the 60s, but they basically stopped then. Those were the only 3. Albania continued on basically until about the early 80s, late 70s, and they stopped. And they actually started buying Chinese SKSs as well and using them too. And Yugoslavia continued making this, the M5966, until 1989. And then China, again, stopped making military ones in 81, and then civilian ones were continued through 94. And that was it. Those were the last SKSs to ever be made. No more have been made since 1994. And like I said, we've got all these various civilian versions like the Model D, the Model M. You've got the paratrooper model, which is not legit. The Chinese military never used a paratrooper model. Never happened. It's an exporter name that was made by the exporters in this country. The sellers in this country wanted a shorter model with a 16-inch barrel like the AK, and they asked China, Norinco, to make a 16-inch model. They obliged, imported it over. They called it the paratrooper model for some reason. Chinese paratroopers never used a 16-inch model. It's a misnomer. It's not accurate. I don't know why they're called that. They're cool. It's an interesting gun, a small, shorter 16-inch barrel. They're cool. They're just not militarily accurate. You effectively have a sporterized gun, you could argue. But they are made from the factory like that. But it's not militarily, historically accurate. That's basically it as far as production and sort of history goes. Now, again, we have, two different types of M21. We have the early, again, the Vietnamese ones, and then we have the late one, like this one. And then, again, the late ones, again, were made in two different eras, 1970, which is this one, and then from 78 to 81 when production resumed. How you can tell which one you have if you actually own one of these? Well, it's going to say right on the side of the receiver. If I can focus in. There we go. It's going to have a big old M21 on the side. Yeah. Now, how to distinguish it from a Vietnamese contract or an export contract over one of these? Well, one, it's going to have a spike bayonet. The Vietnamese ones had a blade. That's pretty obvious. But, stocks could change and whatnot, I guess. How you can tell whether you have one of the late ones is the first four digits. If it has an 0296 or a 416, that's how you can tell. How you can tell them apart also is the big old 70. The 1970 made ones are going to have a big old 070 on them. You can also tell that way. The later ones that were made from 78 to 81 will have a 416. They will have no 70. They'll just have a standard serial number and then a 416 in front of it, and then the M21. Mm-hmm. So that's how you can kind of tell between them. This gun has no factory marks either. M21s, the 70 M21s had no factory marks. They didn't have any factory marks as well. So, I don't know if all of these had the French ticklers. I know some of the later just standard spikers would have a plastic handguard at some point. Some of them would. I'm pretty sure all M21s though had that, and obviously all M21s have the spiker as well. I'm pretty sure the sling mounts are always on the bottom. Again, like I said, they kind of messed around with the sling positions, going from bottom to side. I'm not sure. Every M21 I've seen, I think, pretty much has had it on the bottom, but they kind of mixed it up, kind of just randomly. Like they just kind of, this year we're going to put them on the bottom, and we'll put them on the side next year. They kind of just went up and down and kind of didn't really have any rhyme or reason. They just kind of moved them up and down randomly. So, but that's really about it. I kind of want to I brought the Yugo out just so you can kind of see the quality difference really between the two guns for the most part. I mean, obviously you can just tell the wood is immediately different. Let me move them up a little closer. You can just tell the wood quality is vastly different. Much prettier looking wood, much better quality wood. Really beautiful finish was applied to all of these. Like I said, the Chinese really, really tried on these guns. These M20, the late M21s, they put their best effort forth. They made the best gun they could possibly make. We do have a steel butt plate, trapdoor. You know, the Yugos put a rubber one. And then just looking like at like the trigger guard. I mean, not a huge difference, but the finish is just better. I mean, then just look at the machining in the serial number, like the serial number. It's so clean. Everything is just so clean and straight. I mean, look at the bolt. Just beautiful. And then compare it to that, which is, I mean, not bad, but it's just not even remotely on the same level. I don't know how well you can really capture it with my phone here, but the bluing is just so much better. And just the cuts and the machining quality is just so much better overall. So, pretty nice. Bayonet's kind of crappy, though. Not gonna lie. The bayonet's, kind of worn. I have a feeling this is not the original bayonet this gun had. I have a feeling. This bayonet does not look up to the same standard, so I have a feeling the original bayonet was swapped at some point. Let me flip it over. I'll flip both over, actually. Then it probably becomes a little bit more evident on this side of the differences, maybe. And get them right up on top of each other. So again, just kind of going through, get that down a little bit. And you can just see, I don't know how well you can really tell, but to the eye, it's pretty noticeable. The lines, I mean, the serial numbers are real nice and crisp. This is all just worn and faded. None, all of this is just dull. This is still very sharp. It's just so evident with the magazine. I mean, look at the magazine difference. Very evident. This is, the Chinese also did eventually kind of switch over to like a stamped trigger guard later. Some of the later spikers would have a stamped trigger guard. These are still milled as well. I mean, you kind of go to the back here. I mean, you can see that a little bit. I mean, you got these really rough machining marks on the Yugo, not present on the Chinese. So, I mean, and then got the serial number on the stock, pretty faded, very, very crisp. That's really how I would describe it. This gun is just so much more crisp. It's just so chiseled and crisp over that one. So it's just a gorgeous gun. This is, in my opinion, out of all, I mean, I took a pretty good hard look at pretty much every SKS variant ever made. This is arguably the, aesthetically, in terms of quality and aesthetics, I think easily the best SKS variant ever made. I would have to say. The other one that's pretty close is the East German ones, but those are essentially like unicorns in this country. They are extremely rare. They might be arguably the most rare variant pretty much out there as far as military variants go. Those are pretty nice too. I expect nothing less out of the Germans really though. But yeah, a little bit of a fitting problem. Again, I mean, the bayonet does not snugly fit in the stock. There's a lot of slop. That is also kind of what indicates to me that this is not the original bayonet to the gun, which is sad. But, whatever. Sling is not original. This was a sling I had lying around. It would be period correct. They switched over to the kind of nylon webbing on the spikers. The original Soviet style ones would have had like a leather sling. with the spikers and the M21s and whatnot, they switched to, this style. So it is period correct. Probably not exactly what it would have had, but it is roughly, period correct. So that's about it. It's basically just another SKS though, other than those few differences I pointed out. So this is the early 1970 model, not the later one. And that's about it. I got this gun from a local pawn shop. I traded in my standard Soviet style one. I had a Soviet style Chinese one that was made in, I think it was a 58 or 59 vintage, if I'm not mistaken. I can't remember. I think it was 1958 or 1959. I dated it. So I traded that in. I think I gave him like $50 or 50 or 100, somewhere between $50 and $100 plus the trade in. So that's how I got a hold of this. Decent deal, I think. My Sino Soviet style one was kind of a dog. Stock was horrible. Metal and everything was in good shape, but the stock was just god awful. A lot of the old Soviet style Chinese ones are just dogs. The wood is awful. Even the metal sometimes is terrible. So this thing was greasy. When I took it home and finally got it home, it was really greasy. Whoever previously owned it had been very liberal with the grease and oiling it. I mean, it was kind of ridiculous. Like, calm down. I want to say it might have just been in storage, in packing storage for a really long time with the previous owner. But it really sums it up. And speaking of actually dating your SKS, it's actually pretty easy generally. It's not always true, but if you have an SKS, look at essentially the front suffix. So you'll have kind of your serial number like this, which is 920591. There's going to be like a suffix in front of it that'll be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It goes all the way up to like 26, basically. That basically indicates the year after adoption. And so if your gun is like serial number 1,000,000 something, that essentially implies your gun was made the year after adoption, so 1957. So you basically take the first number of your serial number and add it to 1956. Then, subtract 1, usually, because you have 1960. And so you have to, if it's past 1960, you have to subtract 1, obviously. So if it has if my serial number is 10,000,000 something, 10 plus 1956 minus 1 is 1965. It's not always the case. That is not always the case, but it will generally be accurate, generally. So if you have like a 10,000,000 serial, your gun was probably made in 1965. Not always the case. It's not 100% accurate all the time, but that's generally probably going to be true. So, and I also actually dated, after I made the video on this one yesterday, I actually went and dated this one too. This is an F serial number, which means it was made in 1969. I put it in the description of the video later. I'm going to post the links to how you can date your SKS in this video, and I'm going to post a really good encyclopedia history and everything about the Chinese SKS. There's a good website that documents the Chinese SKS as well, and all of its dozens, like 50 plus variants that were made. I'll link both of those in the description as well. Both of those sites I'll link in the description. That's going to be really about it. If you can find one of these M21s, folks, highly recommend you get it. They're going to command a little bit of a premium, but my God, it is the best looking, best quality SKS ever made. While this one is probably the best shooting. If you're looking for a real shooter SKS, this is probably the best one. So I got the best of both worlds. I got the best aesthetic one and the best shooter. I think I got the two best SKSs probably ever made. So I'm pretty happy. So that's going to about do it. Thank you for tuning in, and I will catch you in the next one.